At 2 p.m. on the afternoon of June 8, 1967, Petty Officer Joe Meters stood on the signal bridge of the USS Liberty, watching Israeli jets circle overhead. The planes were close enough that the crew could wave to the pilots. A Hebrew linguist on board had just assured Meters not to worry. The Israelis had confirmed they'd identified the ship as American. The American flag hung from the mast above. The ship's hull number, GTR-5, was painted in massive letters on both the bow and stern. It was a clear Mediterranean day. Visibility was perfect, 17 miles off the coast of the Sinai Peninsula. International waters. Then, the wings of the Israeli Mirage fighter lit up with machine gun fire. What followed was a 2-hour assault that would kill 34 Americans, wound 171 more, and nearly sink the USS Liberty. But the attack itself was only the beginning of the story. What came after, the cover-up, the silenced survivors, the orders from the White House to call it an accident, would become one of the darkest secrets in American naval history. This is the story of the day America's closest Middle Eastern ally attacked an American ship, and how both governments decided that the truth was too dangerous to tell. The USS Liberty wasn't supposed to be there. Originally christened the SS Simmons Victory, she'd been a cargo vessel in World War II. By 1967, the Navy had converted her into something else entirely, a technical research ship. That was the official designation. The reality was different. The Liberty was a spy ship, bristling with antennas and packed with National Security Agency personnel whose job was to intercept communications. When tensions exploded in the Middle East in early June 1967, the Liberty was pulled from operations off the coast of West Africa and ordered to the eastern Mediterranean. The mission was straightforward: monitor communications during what would become the Six-Day War. Israel had launched preemptive strikes against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan on June 5th. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser had closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping and amassed troops in the Sinai. Israel's response was devastating. Within hours, the Israeli Air Force had destroyed the Egyptian Air Force on the ground. Now Israeli forces were advancing rapidly across the Sinai Peninsula. The Liberty's crew numbered 294 men. Most were in their 20s. They worked below deck in dimly lit compartments filled with electronic equipment, listening to radio transmissions in multiple languages, tracking military movements. The ship was lightly armed, just 4 .50 caliber machine guns, weapons designed to repel boarders, not defend against aircraft. On June 2nd, the Liberty departed Rota, Spain, heading for a position north of the Sinai coast. Orders specified the ship should remain at least 12.5 miles from the Egyptian coast and 6.5 miles from Israeli territory. By June 8th, the Liberty was approximately 17 nautical miles from shore, well outside any claimed territorial waters, flying a full-size American flag that measured 5 feet by 8 feet. The morning of June 8th was quiet. Israeli reconnaissance aircraft flew over multiple times starting at dawn, 8 separate flights between 6 a.m. and 1 p.m. The planes circled low, close enough that crew members could see the Star of David on the fuselages. Some were so close, the deck plating rattled from the engine noise. Each time, the Liberty did nothing. These were aircraft from an allied nation. There was no reason for concern. In the ship's communication spaces, the NSA technicians went about their work. In the engine rooms, sailors monitored the machinery that kept the Liberty moving at 5 knots through calm seas. On the bridge, the watch kept their eyes on the horizon. Lieutenant Commander James Ennis had just taken over as officer of the deck. The Mediterranean stretched out in all directions, blue and peaceful. From this distance, you couldn't tell that men were dying on shore. At 2 p.m., contact was made with 3 surface radar returns approaching at high speed. Then, aircraft appeared on the same heading. 5 minutes later, at 2:05 p.m., 2 Israeli Mirage fighter jets screamed in from the west and opened fire. The first indication was the sound, a roar of jet engines at low altitude. Then, the ship shuddered as 30mm cannon rounds tore into the hull. The Mirages came in low, strafing from stem to stern. Their cannon fire ripped through the Liberty's thin skin, punching holes in metal, shredding equipment, killing men who never had time to understand what was happening. The initial targets were deliberate: the communications antennas, the bridge, and the 4 machine guns positioned on deck. Radioman Joe Meters watched from the signal bridge as the wings lit up with muzzle flashes. He'd been told not to worry. The Israelis knew who they were. Now those same aircraft were killing his shipmates. The Liberty's captain, Commander William McGonigal, was on the bridge. Cannon fire raked the ship. Men fell wounded and dying. McGonigal grabbed the ship's intercom and sounded general quarters, battle stations, but the communication systems were already being destroyed. The Liberty's ability to call for help was being systematically eliminated. After the Mirages exhausted their ammunition, they peeled off. For a moment, there was relative silence, just the sound of men screaming, fires starting, the groan of damaged metal. Then, the second wave arrived. Super Mystère fighter bombers came in next. These carried more than cannons. They dropped napalm. The jellied gasoline bombs exploded across the Liberty's deck, creating walls of flame. The napalm stuck to everything it touched: metal, equipment, men. Sailors caught in the inferno had nowhere to run. Some jumped overboard into the Mediterranean. The napalm floated on the water's surface, burning. The Super Mystères made repeated passes, firing rockets and strafing with their internal cannons. The Liberty was defenseless. Her machine guns had been destroyed in the first minutes of the attack. She had no surface-to-air missiles, no effective anti-aircraft capability. All she could do was take the punishment and try to survive. In the communication spaces below deck, sailors worked desperately to repair damaged equipment and get a distress signal out. But the Israelis were jamming American emergency frequencies. Every channel the Liberty tried was blocked by electronic noise. The jamming was precise, targeted, professional. It required knowledge of American military radio frequencies. Below deck, the scene was chaos. Wounded men were dragged to makeshift medical stations. Fires spread through compartments. Smoke filled the passageways. Damage control teams worked to contain the flooding and extinguish flames, while cannon rounds continued to punch through the hull above them. Then, at approximately 2:24 p.m., 35 minutes after the air attack began, 3 motor torpedo boats from the Israeli Navy's MTB Division 914 appeared on the horizon. They were approaching at high speed, white wakes trailing behind them. Each boat bore an Israeli flag. Some crew members on deck felt a moment of hope. Israeli boats. Maybe they were coming to help. Maybe they'd realized the terrible mistake. The torpedo boats opened fire with deck-mounted cannons. The 3 Israeli motor torpedo boats circled the Liberty like sharks, firing 20mm and 40mm cannons. The range was close, point blank. There was no possibility of mistaken identity at this distance. The American flag was clearly visible. The hull numbers GTR-5 were painted in letters 10 feet high on both the bow and stern. English letters, not Arabic. The ship's profile matched no Egyptian vessel. This was not the El Qusair, the Egyptian ship Israel would later claim they'd confused for the Liberty. At 2:35 p.m., one of the torpedo boats fired. The torpedo struck the Liberty on the starboard side, tearing a massive hole in the hull opposite the communication spaces. The explosion was catastrophic. 25 men died instantly in that single blast, most of them NSA technicians and linguists who'd been working at their stations, listening to intercepted radio traffic. The research spaces flooded immediately. Bodies and equipment were thrown against bulkheads. Those who survived the initial explosion found themselves trapped in darkness as water rushed in. The Liberty listed to starboard. Water poured through the 39-foot-wide hole in her side. Her keel was twisted. For a moment, it seemed certain she would sink. In the spaces adjacent to the blast, sailors fought to keep the ship afloat. They sealed doors and hatches, containing the flooding to the damaged sections. They stabilized the ship's list by counter-flooding compartments on the port side. All of this while the Israeli boats continued to fire. On deck, Commander McGonigal had been wounded by shrapnel. He remained on the bridge, refusing medical treatment, directing damage control efforts and trying to keep his ship alive. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Philip Armstrong, Jr., had been killed in the air attack. Many of the Liberty's senior officers were dead or wounded. The ship's organization was shattered, but the crew kept fighting. The torpedo boats came in close. Some survivors report as close as 50 yards. They could see the Israeli crews clearly. The boats continued firing their cannons, raking the Liberty's deck. Then, the crew lowered lifeboats into the water, preparing to abandon ship if necessary. International law is clear. Attacking lifeboats is a war crime. The Israeli boats opened fire on the lifeboats. Cannon rounds shredded the inflatable rafts. Some lifeboats were machine-gunned while still in the davits before they could be lowered. Others were shot up after they hit the water. The message was clear. No one was meant to escape. No one was meant to survive. During the attack, a sailor named James Terry Halbardier performed an act of extraordinary courage. Under Israeli fire, he climbed the mast and repaired communication lines that had been shot away. His actions allowed the Liberty to finally get a distress signal out. For this, Halbardier would later receive the Silver Star. Many Liberty survivors believe the ship would have sunk without his heroism. The distress call reached the 6th Fleet. Aircraft carriers USS Saratoga and USS America immediately launched fighters to defend the Liberty. F-4 Phantom jets, armed and ready for combat, screamed off the carrier decks the Liberty would be saved. Then, minutes after the jets launched, they were recalled. The order came from Washington, from Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The fighters turned back. Admiral Thomas Moorer, who would later become chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called it the most disgraceful act I witnessed in my entire military career. The Liberty and her crew were ordered to fight alone. At approximately 3:15 p.m., an Israeli helicopter appeared. It circled the burning ship. Survivors could see the markings clearly. Inside the helicopter, Israeli personnel photographed the damage. The radio intercepts would later reveal what the helicopter pilots reported back to their base at Hatzor. They'd found a warship which we attacked with men jumping into the water. The pilots were ordered to search for survivors, but then, significantly, another message from Israeli headquarters: the ship was Egyptian. The helicopter should return to base. At 3:30 p.m., more than an hour and 25 minutes after the attack began, the Israeli forces withdrew. The USS Liberty was still afloat. 34 Americans were dead. Another 171 were wounded, many critically. The ship had 821 holes in her hull. Her superstructure looked like it had been through a meat grinder. Fires still burned. Compartments were flooded. Blood ran across the decks and sloshed in the gun tubs, mixed with seawater. But she was still afloat. Her crew had kept her alive. Later that evening, U.S. Navy destroyers USS Davis and USS Massey arrived, along with the cruiser USS Little Rock. Medical teams transferred aboard. The wounded received treatment. The dead were counted and identified. 6 men remained missing. Their bodies never recovered from the flooded spaces. As darkness fell on June 8, 1967, the Liberty began the slow journey toward Malta for emergency repairs. Her American flag, torn and burnt from the attack, still flew from the mast. And in Washington, D.C., a very different kind of operation was already underway. When President Lyndon Johnson was first notified of the attack, he assumed the Soviet Union was responsible. The Cold War was at its height. Soviet naval forces operated in the Mediterranean. The initial reports said American ships were under attack. Johnson immediately feared this could be the spark that ignited World War III. Then word came, the attacking forces were Israeli. The president's reaction, according to those present, was immediate and forceful. Johnson expressed strong dismay to Israeli Ambassador Avraham Harman. Within hours, the Israeli government began sending apologies. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol apologized. Foreign Minister Abba Eban apologized. Within 48 hours, Israel offered compensation. The official Israeli explanation: mistaken identity. They thought the Liberty was an Egyptian vessel, the El Qusair, that had been shelling Israeli positions near El Arish. The American government publicly accepted this explanation. But privately, something very different was happening. On June 10th, just 2 days after the attack, a message went out to Liberty survivors. Do not discuss the attack with anyone, not with family, not with friends, not with the press. The survivors were told they would face court-martial if they spoke about what had happened. Some were told they could face prison. Others were simply threatened with the end of their naval careers. The Naval Court of Inquiry convened quickly, too quickly. Admiral Isaac C. Kidd, Jr. was appointed to lead the investigation. Captain Ward Boston was assigned as senior legal counsel. They were given 1 week to investigate an attack that had killed 34 men and nearly sunk an American ship. 1 week to interview survivors, review evidence, and produce findings. The investigation took place while Liberty survivors were still hospitalized. Many were never interviewed. The inquiry was conducted in secret. The final report, except for a small declassified section released to the press, was classified top secret. It would remain classified for 9 years until forced out under the Freedom of Information Act in 1976. What the report concluded, there was insufficient evidence to determine why Israel had attacked the ship. But it stopped short of assigning blame. It did not call it an accident. It did not exonerate Israel. It simply said the evidence was inconclusive. But that's not what the public was told. The official story became mistaken identity, an accident of war. Tragic, but unintentional. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara told Congress on July 26, 1967. It was the conclusion of the investigatory body, headed by an admiral of the Navy in whom we have great confidence, that the attack was not intentional. Except that wasn't actually what the investigation had concluded. The findings had been rewritten, modified. The original report had been more ambiguous. Government attorneys had changed the language to be more favorable to Israel. For 35 years, Captain Ward Boston kept quiet about what he knew. He was a military man. He followed orders. But in 2002, after reading a book by historian A.J. Cristall that argued the attack was an accident, Boston could no longer remain silent. In January 2003, Boston signed a legal affidavit. His statement was clear and unambiguous. President Lyndon Johnson and Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered Admiral Kidd to conclude that the attack was a case of mistaken identity, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Boston stated he was certain the Israeli pilots knew the Liberty was an American ship. The flag was visible. The markings were in English. The ship's profile matched no Egyptian vessel. At the ranges the aircraft and torpedo boats operated, misidentification was impossible. Boston's affidavit concluded, "I am outraged at the efforts of the apologists for Israel in this country to claim that this attack was a case of mistaken identity." Boston died in 2008, but his affidavit remains. It's one of the most damning pieces of evidence that the official investigation was a cover-up ordered at the highest levels of the American government. He wasn't alone in his conclusions. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, who served under President Johnson, later wrote in his memoirs, "I was never satisfied with the Israeli explanation. Their sustained attack to disable and sink Liberty precluded an assault by accident or by some trigger-happy local commander. I didn't believe them then, and I don't believe them now." Richard Helms, director of the CIA in 1967, said in interviews years later, "To say that this was an accident is drawing a pretty long bow in view of the evidence." The NSA's director at the time, Lieutenant General Marshall Carter, stated in a 1988 interview that he believed the attack couldn't be anything else but deliberate. His deputy, Dr. Louis Tordella, agreed. "I believe it was a deliberate attack." Admiral Thomas Moorer, who became chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, conducted his own independent investigation years later. He concluded that Israel had deliberately attacked the Liberty, likely to prevent the ship from monitoring Israeli military communications as Israel prepared to invade Syria's Golan Heights the next day. An invasion the United States opposed. Even George Christian, President Johnson's press secretary, later admitted that no one in the White House believed that the attack was accidental. These weren't conspiracy theorists. These were the highest-ranking military and intelligence officials in the United States government, and every one of them believed the attack was deliberate. But if the attack was deliberate, the question becomes, why? What possible reason would Israel have for attacking an American ship? Several theories have been proposed. The most widely discussed is this: the Liberty was monitoring Israeli military communications. On June 9th, the day after the attack, Israel launched an assault on Syria's Golan Heights. The United States had made clear it opposed any Israeli attack on Syria, fearing it would bring the Soviet Union, Syria's ally, directly into the war. If the Liberty had intercepted communications revealing Israel's plans to attack Syria, And if that intelligence had reached Washington in time, the U.S. might have intervened to stop the operation. By silencing the Liberty, Israel eliminated that risk. Others have suggested the Liberty may have intercepted evidence of Israeli war crimes, specifically the execution of Egyptian prisoners of war. Journalist James Bamford has reported on claims from U.S. intelligence personnel that the Liberty may have been monitoring communications related to such atrocities. A third theory: Israel simply couldn't risk an American intelligence ship monitoring its military operations during a critical phase of the war. The Liberty had the capability to intercept virtually every radio transmission in the region. For a country fighting a war on multiple fronts, that level of intelligence exposure was intolerable, even if the intelligence was going to an ally. What we know for certain is this: the Israeli military knew the Liberty was there. Multiple Israeli reconnaissance flights had observed the ship throughout the morning. The Liberty's position had been reported to Israeli naval headquarters. According to declassified documents, Israeli headquarters knew the ship was American at least 3 hours before the attack. But this information was apparently never passed to the pilots and boat commanders who carried out the assault. That's the official Israeli explanation: a communications failure. The pilots and sailors genuinely believed they were attacking an Egyptian vessel. The problem is that explanation doesn't hold up under scrutiny. The Liberty looks nothing like the El Qusair. The Liberty displaced 10,000 tons and was 455 feet long. The El Qusair was less than half that size at 1,100 tons. The Liberty had a distinctive forest of antennas, including a prominent moon bounce antenna used for satellite communications, that made her instantly recognizable as an intelligence vessel. The El Qusair was a simple cargo ship with no such equipment. The Liberty was making 5 knots. The El Qusair was reported to be making 28 knots, more than 5 times faster. Even if Israeli forces couldn't identify the ship visually, the speed difference alone should have made clear this wasn't the vessel they were looking for. The attack lasted over 2 hours. During that time, Israeli aircraft made multiple passes. They approached from different angles at different altitudes in clear weather with perfect visibility. The American flag was flying. At close range, it was unmistakable. The torpedo boats came in close enough that crew members could see the faces of the Israeli sailors. They could see the Star of David painted on the boats. At that range, the American flag would have been equally visible. And then there's the machine gunning of the lifeboats. If this was truly a case of mistaken identity, why would Israeli forces fire on lifeboats? Why prevent the crew from abandoning ship? That action serves only one purpose: ensuring there are no survivors. A 2007 Chicago Tribune investigation uncovered testimony from former U.S. military personnel with first-hand knowledge of the incident. According to these sources, NSA intercepts of Israeli communications during the attack show that Israeli pilots identified the ship as American before opening fire. One pilot reportedly radioed that he could see an American flag. He was ordered to proceed with the attack anyway. The NSA has never officially confirmed these intercepts exist. When asked, they've stated they have no such recordings, but multiple former NSA personnel have gone on record saying they heard the transmissions. They heard Israeli pilots confirm the ship was American, and they heard the order from Israeli ground control to attack regardless. If true, this would be conclusive proof that the attack was deliberate. It would also explain why the NSA has fought so hard to keep these intercepts classified. What we're left with is a pile of evidence that doesn't support the official story. We have senior U.S. officials who were there saying it was deliberate. We have Israeli reconnaissance flights that observed the ship for hours. We have the sustained nature of the attack. Over 2 hours, multiple aircraft, torpedo boats, systematic targeting of communications and defenses. We have the machine gunning of lifeboats. We have the precise jamming of American radio frequencies. And we have an official investigation that was ordered to reach a predetermined conclusion: mistaken identity. The Liberty limped into Valletta, Malta on June 14th, 6 days after the attack. The damage was catastrophic. The 39-foot hole in her starboard side, the twisted keel, the 821 shell holes, the burned and shredded superstructure. Engineers estimated repair costs at $10 million, more than the ship was worth. The Navy declared the Liberty damaged beyond economical repair. After temporary patches in Malta, she returned to the United States on July 27, 1967. She was decommissioned on June 28, 1968, exactly 1 year and 20 days after the attack. The Liberty was laid up in the Atlantic Reserve Fleet until 1970, then transferred to the Maritime Administration for disposal. In 1973, she was sold for scrap to the Boston Metals Company of Baltimore. Today, nothing remains of the USS Liberty except photographs, declassified documents, and the memories of survivors. Commander William McGonigal was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the attack. Remarkably, the ceremony was not held at the White House, as is traditional for Medal of Honor recipients. Instead, it took place at the Washington Navy Yard with no press coverage. President Johnson did not attend. The award was presented by the Secretary of the Navy. It was the only Medal of Honor from the Vietnam War era not presented at the White House. McGonigal later said he wanted to believe the attack was pure error, but couldn't accept that explanation. He joined other Liberty survivors in calling for a congressional investigation. He died in 1999. The investigation he sought never happened. 11 members of the Liberty's crew received Silver Stars. 20 were awarded Bronze Stars. More than 200 received Purple Hearts. The USS Liberty became one of the most highly decorated ships for a single action in U.S. naval history. President Johnson signed the Presidential Unit Citation in 1968, but it wasn't formally presented to the crew until June 1991, 24 years later. President George H.W. Bush declined to attend the ceremony. He waved at the crew while passing by but did not stop to speak. The 6 men whose remains were never recovered are buried together under a single headstone in a mass grave at Arlington National Cemetery, Section 34. Their marker reads simply, "Died in the Eastern Mediterranean, June 8, 1967. Every year on June 8th, Liberty survivors gather at that grave. They're fewer now, age and time taking their toll. But they still come, they still remember, and they still demand answers. In May 1968, Israel paid the United States government $332 million in compensation for the families of the 34 men killed. In March 1969, Israel paid another $357 million to the wounded. In December 1980, Israel agreed to pay $6 million as final settlement for material damage to the ship, plus 13 years of interest. Total compensation, just under $13 million. The matter was officially closed by an exchange of diplomatic notes on December 17, 1987, but for the survivors, nothing has ever been closed. The USS Liberty Veterans Association has spent decades fighting for a proper congressional investigation. They've submitted detailed reports to the Department of Defense documenting evidence of a deliberate attack. They've called for investigations into war crimes, specifically the jamming of distress frequencies, the use of unmarked aircraft, and the machine gunning of lifeboats. Every request has been denied or ignored. Multiple presidents have been petitioned: Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush again, Obama, Trump, Biden. Every administration has maintained the same position. The matter was investigated in 1967 and determined to be an accident. Case closed. Congress has never held formal hearings on the USS Liberty attack. Not in 57 years. The survivors have never been permitted to testify under oath before Congress about what they witnessed. Why? Why this extraordinary, sustained effort to keep the Liberty story buried? The answer lies in geopolitics and the U.S.-Israel relationship. In 1967, Israel was America's closest ally in the Middle East during the Cold War. The Soviet Union was backing Egypt and Syria. The last thing the Johnson administration wanted was a public confrontation with Israel that might drive them closer to the Soviets or destabilize the region. There's also the matter of what the Liberty was doing. As a signals intelligence ship operating for the NSA, the Liberty's activities were, and remain, highly classified. A full public investigation would require revealing details about American intelligence collection capabilities. Those capabilities were valuable. More valuable, apparently, than the truth about what happened to the Liberty and her crew. And finally, there's the domestic political calculation. The pro-Israel lobby in the United States is powerful. Any politician who appeared to be attacking Israel or questioning the U.S.-Israel relationship risked facing organized opposition. It was easier, politically safer, to accept Israel's explanation and move on. So that's what happened. The Liberty story was buried. The survivors were ordered to stay silent. The investigations were classified. The press largely ignored it. And slowly, as years turned to decades, the USS Liberty faded from public memory. But the survivors never forgot. They never stopped telling their story to anyone who would listen. And gradually, bits of truth have emerged. Declassified documents, sworn affidavits from participants, testimonies from former intelligence officials, NSA intercepts partially released under the Freedom of Information Act. The full truth may never be known. Key documents remain classified. The original NSA intercepts of Israeli communications during the attack, if they exist, have never been released. Witnesses have died. Memories have faded. Some records may have been destroyed. What remains is a story of betrayal. American servicemen were attacked by a supposed ally, left to die by their own government, ordered to stay silent, and denied justice for nearly 6 decades. It's a story that raises fundamental questions about what nations owe to the men and women who serve in their military, about whether political alliances matter more than American lives, about whether the truth is sometimes too inconvenient to tell. Joe Meters, the sailor who stood on the signal bridge and watched the Israeli Mirages open fire, is still alive. He's in his 70s now. He spent most of his adult life trying to get someone in power to listen to what he saw that day, to acknowledge that the attack wasn't an accident, to admit that the Liberty crew was abandoned and betrayed. He's still waiting for that acknowledgement. So are the families of the 34 men who died, the 171 who were wounded, the survivors who carry the physical and psychological scars of June 8, 1967. They're still waiting for the truth. And the rest of us, we should be asking why, 57 years later, that truth is still considered too dangerous to tell. If this story revealed something you didn't know, something they didn't teach in history class, then do something small that makes a big difference. Hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube that forgotten history matters and that more people deserve to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next buried story we bring back to light. Every day, we uncover truths hidden in classified files and fading testimonies, stories of ordinary people facing impossible odds and sometimes being abandoned by the very systems meant to protect them. True history. Hard truths. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Are you tuning in from the United States, Europe, the Middle East, somewhere totally unexpected? And if someone in your family served in the Navy, or if you have a connection to this story, share that too. Your voice is part of what keeps these memories from being completely buried. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring about the truth. And thank you for helping ensure that the crew of the USS Liberty and the 34 men who died that day are never forgotten. Because as long as we remember them and keep asking questions, the cover-up never fully succeeds.